So Ansible, I don't know if everybody is familiar with Ansible or if anybody's familiar with Ansible, but what Ansible is a tool that it helps you to automate things like server and cloud provisioning, configuration management, and application deployment. NetApp IT started using Ansible in about 2014, mostly for Unix or Linux server configuration management. But in about May of 2018, we released some new modules specific to ONTAP management. And when those modules were released, that really kind of was a game changer for how we use Ansible within IT, and it really started to take off. So now we're moving into more cloud orchestration. We're using Ansible in our next generation data center deployment that we're doing. So we're using it quite a bit more, and we're specifically using it quite a bit more in our storage administration and configuration management. So what I'm really going to talk about today, for the most part, is how we're doing our builds using Ansible. So with a combination of modules that are all supported by Ansible, the modules that are and supported by NetApp as well, the modules that are from NetApp for ONTAP management, the modules that are from Cisco for Cisco management, and the modules that are from InfoBlocks for DNS management. Using those modules, we have been able to fully automate our day 0 through day 1 deployment. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what day 0 and day 1 deployment is. If you ask different people, you probably get different answers. But for me, day 0 would mean, the day after the hardware is, fully racked and cabled and configured according to the Visio document that we put together that says basically this is how it should look physically. Once it's presented to me physically and it's turned on, that's day 0. And then I have to make it so that it's capable of serving data. Day 1 would be once it's capable of serving data and not just sitting there and consuming electricity, we have to actually make it serve data and give that data over to servers so that it can be used for something. So that would be what I call day 1. So using a combination of those modules, we've been able to fully automate that entire process. And as you can see on the slide, it was basically a 2-day process. At one point, it was about a 7-day process. We fine-tuned everything and got it down to about a 2-day process. And now with this, I can do the whole process in 10 minutes. So, there are modules, Ansible modules for NetApp for other stuff than just ONTAP. There's modules for Element OS, which is the SolidFire operating system, and for E-Series management. And you can find all the documentation for that stuff at docs.ansible.com. And I'll provide these slides for everyone so that when everything is said and done, you can go and peruse the slides and peruse the documentation and any links that are included in it. So these are the list of tasks that I completed with the Ansible automation. So it doesn't look like a lot when you look at it here, but it really is a lot, because if you consider each one of these tasks can take anywhere from 10 to even 20 commands to complete, then you can start to see, okay, that would probably be somewhere around 200 commands that I saved myself by just doing all this automation. And the day 1, some of those tasks take even more. Building an SVM, if you've ever built an SVM, it's a time-consuming process. You got to gather a lot of information, and then you've got to run all those commands using the information that you have. A lot of opportunities for typos and things like that. And that's kind of the point. One of the main reasons why we wanted to automate some of these tasks is because you kind of alleviate some of the risk of human error and making mistakes. But then you gain back all of that time. There's a lot of time lost in, you get started on something, you're working, then you get an interruption, you have to stop, and then you go back, and then you have to figure out where you left off, and so it leaves a lot of time on the table, wasted trying to figure out where you were, or searching for some information to run a command or things like that. If you can automate it all, you just kick it off, walk away, come back with your coffee, and it's done. Oh, I keep clicking on that. So this is kind of a flow chart that explains how the whole process kind of works. So the start, I consider start to be the day that I order the hardware. So when I place my order because we're customer one, we follow the same process that our customers do. So we don't have a salesperson, but I'm our salesperson. So I go through and I spec out all the hardware and I decide what all we need. Following probably the same process that our NetApp sales team uses. I'm not sure, but once I've done that and I click go and I place the order, then I know, okay, that order is going to arrive in, say, 4 weeks. Well, that gives me time I know what the hardware looks like now. It gives me time to put together all of my documentation around that, and then it also gives me time to develop my playbooks for the automation that's going to happen once the hardware gets here. So I'm not just, sitting on my hands waiting for hardware to arrive. I'm actually doing a few things to make sure that I'm prepared when it gets here. Would be the same that you would be doing if you were not automating everything, only you would just be getting all your IP addresses set up and get all of your documentation together and things like that. The difference here is I'm just writing a playbook based on what I know I have, so that when it gets here, all I have to do is wait for them to rack and cable it and then click go. So once I've developed all my playbooks based on what I know I just ordered, I can run the first playbook, which is going to create all of my DNS for all of my cluster management, for all of my SVMs, for all of my cluster interconnect switches. It's going to give me all of my IP addresses for all those things. Next, the hardware's been racked and cabled. This is where day zero really starts. I have to manually run the cluster setup wizard. And the reason for this is because in NetApp IT, and probably within most IT organizations, we're not going to run DHCP for clusters and servers and things like that, because we want a static IP address, something that we can always reference and we know exactly what it's going to be at all times. So since we don't have DHCP enabled, when the system is powered on, it doesn't have an IP configured and it's not really accessible. So I have to manually connect with the console and configure that first IP and create the cluster. So that takes about maybe 3 minutes to do. So I run that, and then it's configured, and then I do the same thing for the cluster interconnect switches. There's a basic configuration that you have to run that basically just sets your management IP and those things for the cluster interconnect switches. So once you have those, now you can access them remotely. You can go ahead and run the switch configuration playbook, and then you run the day zero playbook, and you run the day one playbook. And then you just have to we run config advisor against all of our systems to make sure that everything is configured properly and there's no system errors or issues that we may have missed by manually looking over everything. And then we have a checklist that we go through. So we'll have a meeting with the team where we all go through the checklist and we make sure that everything is done the way it was supposed to be done, and then we do a little brief explanation of what the cluster is going to be used for, and then we turn it over. So, and that's the kind of the whole process of how we go from where we start to having a cluster that's serving data and is ready for everyone to use. So I wanted to show you some examples of what the plays within the playbook look like. So currently we're running 3 separate playbooks. One playbook to get all the DNS entries, one playbook to configure the cluster interconnect switches, and another playbook to configure the cluster. Actually, it's 4, because there's another playbook to create the SVMs and volumes and set up the export tables and those types of things. So there's 4 playbooks that we run. We're not currently using the SVM piece or the day 1 piece because we're using WFA in-house right now. We're trying to build that in-house trust that our automation will work without failure or having any problems. So once we've developed all the trust that we think we need, then we'll go ahead and start using Ansible in-house. And as I said, the new modules were just released in May, so there's a bit of a learning curve and, like I said, a trust factor that has to be built up there. But so for the example here, this is it's probably the simplest play you can write within Ansible. There's a comment that basically is just for when you're editing it, you can see where this play starts and kind of gives you a generic explanation. This one configures NTP. The name section is actually a required field, and it's what's going to be printed when the task runs. And I'll show you some output later that has where you can see that name field gets printed out. The next piece is going to be the actual module that gets called. So in this case, there's a file in the Ansible path that is called ONTAP ntp.yml, because all of the files are no, not YML. This is actually .py. It's a Python module that gets called. So when that module gets called from within Ansible, it's going to do all the things that are below. The next line is the state. The state can either be present or absent, and it's just as it sounds. It's either going to make it present or it's going to make it absent. It's going to put it in or take it out. One quick note on Ansible. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the term of or the idea of idempotence or idempotence. Basically means that it's going to be able to go through and check, and if the state is what it's expecting, then it's not going to make any changes. If it goes through and checks and the state is not what it expects, so if it's not present, then it's going to make it present. So, and you can, what this allows you to do is it allows you to rerun the same playbook over and over and over without worrying that you're going to break something. One of the great things for configuration management, in my opinion. So that the state, then the next pieces are all going to be either variables or things that you're actually going to set. So you're going to set your NTP version. In this case, we're setting it to auto, so we don't have to stress about what version we want to use. And then the server name. So you want to set your NTP server name. In this case, it's in our lab. So, and the last 3 are variables. So the host name variable, the username variable. So the host name is going to be the host name that of the cluster that you're going to be making changes to. The username is going to be the username that you're using to authenticate, and password is obviously the password for that username so that you can authenticate. These are variables that can be passed in from the command line with a -e option, or they can be configured in a configuration file that gets read at the time of execution. So the next example is a slightly more complicated version. Again, you have a lot of the same pieces. You still have the comment at the top. You still have the name field for the name of the task or play that you're going to be running. the module that you're going to call, the state, your authentication, and some variables that you're going to set. The big difference with this one is you have a list at the bottom. So in this case, that's just a list of license codes. You could go through and put an individual play for each individual license, but that would make for a very large playbook, especially if you're doing, say you're doing a 6-node cluster, and each cluster has 10 licenses, well then you're going to have 60 plays just to install the licenses. You wouldn't want to do that. But you could do one play with a list of 60 items and then call each one of those items to install the license. And that's what we're doing here. It's just like a loop in a script, like a while loop. While there's still items in this list, continue to add those license codes. And then finally, there's probably the most complicated module that we're using, or not module, method that we're using in any of our playbooks that we're doing the automation with, and that's going to be key value pairs. In this case, it's a list of key value pairs. And it's the same concept. It's going to go through, and while there's still items in the list, it's going to continue to run, and it's going to iterate through each key value pair in that row. So it's going to, you could see where there's name, node, and port. It's going to call each one and then pull that value from that line, and then it's going to go to the next line once it's iterated through each key value pair in that line. A little bit more complicated, but still pretty straightforward. And those are the big three that we're using within our modules. We're using, or our playbooks. We're using a couple of other ones for getting input. You know, we can request that the user input something, doing a little bit of that. We're trying to steer away from that as much as possible and pull as much as we can automatically without asking for too much input, because again, when you ask for input, you tend to get typos and mistakes and things like that. So I said before, I was going to show you some examples of output. This is that. The play, you can see at the top where it says play localhost. It's using the localhost to connect to the cluster, because Ansible is agentless. There's no agent running on the cluster that it has to connect to. So it usually uses SSH or HTTP or whatever protocol to connect. In this case, these modules were written around the NMSDK, which uses HTTP, but it has to use HTTP from somewhere, so it's using the connection from the localhost to do that. So, and then I told you that it's going to show you the name of each one, the section where it says dash name and then it has a name. This is that name. This is that section that prints out where it says task, rename aggregates. That's a task in the playbook. Once it runs, it looks for that name section and it says, hey, this is what I'm doing now. And I'm only showing successes. I didn't show any failures. If it's a success and it runs properly, it's going to say okay. If you're running it from a Linux machine like I do, it's going to be green. If it's a failure, it's going to say failed and it's going to be red. And that's really, there's some possible other instances where maybe it doesn't quite fail, but it doesn't quite run the way you expected it to, and that might be yellow. But it'll give you a message that's pretty self-explanatory as to how it passes or fails. And again, this is an example of the licenses, the list that I was showing you before. And then on this one, this is an example of the key value pairs output. So it's going to give you the output with each one of the key value pairs that it input. So node, the node name, IP, the IP address, the mask, the gateway, so on and so forth, all the key value pairs. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about, and I was hoping that I could get you guys to have some questions and we can talk through a few things. Does anybody have any questions?
Ezra, there's some questions on the chat. There's one from Rory. Can you run these in parallel, or do they all need to be sequential?
So in this case, they need to be sequential just because, you know, step B requires that step A is completed. So, like for example, I have to have the cluster interconnect switches configured properly before I build the cluster out, because if the cluster interconnect switch isn't right, then the cluster is not going to be right, because it requires that connectivity. And then I need to run the IP addresses before I can run the cluster interconnect switch or the cluster, because I need those IPs in order to configure the cluster. Now, what I can do is, once we've gotten to a state where we feel really comfortable with our setup, I could combine all these playbooks together into one giant playbook and just run it. And they would all be in the same order, but you know, it would be a lot easier. I don't have to run one, go back, run the next one. I can just run one, go get a coffee, talk to somebody in the break room, and then come back and it's done. So, does that answer your question, or? Okay, were there any other questions?
I think, yeah, you've answered that for Rory, so he would speak, I know him, so he would ask more of the...
Yeah, he said yes, I see on the chat there.
All right, okay. There's a question from Gavin, and he says, for smaller customer not using Ansible, Puppet, etc., how much of these processes can be followed through WFA?
All of them. Every single process can be done through WFA. I actually, probably, I guess it was 2, maybe 3 years ago now, I wrote a set of scripts in Perl that used NMSDK to do this task. And then I later imported all of those into WFA. And there is a day zero build workflow that comes in WFA. It's available in the automation store, I'm pretty sure. So all of these tasks can be completed with WFA. I don't think the day zero build in WFA is as mature as this is. Ansible has had a lot of time and effort and money poured into it, and that particular piece of WFA, that particular workflow, once I wrote it and I handed it off to the WFA team, I kind of abandoned it, and I don't know if they've continued a lot of work to improve it. So it may be, I mean, when I wrote that, I was basing it off of 8.0 or maybe 8.1. So it's pretty old. But to answer your question, yes, you could use WFA to do all of these things, or you could write your own custom script in Perl or Python that does the same thing. I've done that for many different instances. I just had a discussion with Google a month ago around that very topic. I just saw somebody ask, can a playbook call another playbook? Yes, a playbook can call another playbook. There's also a thing called Ansible Tower, and it's kind of like an orchestration for your orchestration. So it can manage all of your playbooks and have them run in a specific order based on different tasks and things like that. On that, I'm not the guru. I think eventually we're going to have Dave Fox come in and do one of these, and he is the guru for Ansible as a whole and Ansible Tower. So he would be able to talk about those more. Let me see if I can get...
Ezra, there's a few more questions on there. There's one from Kevin. Is there any help available on these modules, as I am having some issue with the flows, and I'm working on when using with the loops?
So the modules are supported. I think you can open a support case for the Ansible modules. I'm pretty sure you can. because they are supported by NetApp. So if it's supported by NetApp, then you should be able to open a support case and get help on those types of things. But there is documentation at docs.ansible.com. Using the loops is more of an Ansible-specific question, where using the specific modules is a more NetApp-related question. So if you open a case with NetApp support and say, hey, I'm trying to figure out how to make a loop in Ansible, they're going to go, that's not us. But if you call and you say, hey, I'm trying to install these licenses using Ansible and it doesn't work, then they can go, oh, okay, yeah, that is us. But yeah,
okay.
I would thoroughly suggest that you, there's some excellent classes on Udemy, and I think they're only like $9.99. Yeah, they're really cheap, and it'll really be helpful if you're just starting out with Ansible to kind of get the swing of it. I had not touched Ansible before these modules were released. I was tasked to do it, and I took a look at the modules, and we had some older modules that were kind of incomplete. And, you know, I just looked at the modules and I said, these modules won't do everything that we need to do. Perhaps we should, you know, revisit this after they become more mature. So then some people asked me for my input, and I basically provided the documentation that I had written for my scripts, the automation scripts using NMSDK. And they said, oh, this is great. We'll use these as our starting point. And so the first 33 modules that they released were all based off of the script that I wrote to automate the builds. And then from there, it's just expanded exponentially.
Okay, Ezra, there's a couple more questions.
Okay.
There was a question some time ago while you were presenting on key value pair, and
okay.
Andy replied to it as well. I don't know if you can see it.
I need to figure out how to use the chat. There we go. Key value pairs, 2 items in a list. Okay, that's the answer. Hold on.
The other one is, do you have any sample playbooks?
I do. I will. I have to clean them up a little bit, and then I can hand them over when I send this out. When I say clean them up, they run the way they are, but I mean, I want to make sure that I don't hand out any passwords or host names or anything like that might be a security issue. But yeah, so that I will provide some example playbooks, and that might help with the loop question. But the key value pair question, I'm looking. The key value pair. So I'll show you the example again. So key value pair, the key in this instance here, so this is a list of key value pairs. In this instance, the first key is going to be name, and the value is going to be the interface name, which is A0A, which again in this case is going to be the name of the if group that I'm creating. And then the next key value pair in this list or in this particular item is going to be node, and then the value is going to be the actual node name. And then the next key is going to be port, and then the value is going to be E5A, which is the network port that's going to be part of that if group. So does that kind of answer your question how the key value pairs work? It's really helpful if you're doing things like port configuration or exports where you need to do multiple items in an individual list. It would be comparable to a hash in Perl if you're a scripter or programmer. Like a list of lists or an array of arrays or something like that. So were there any other questions? I'm trying to read through the chat now. Yeah, so the help is available if you go look at the documentation, or again, I would really highly recommend checking out the Udemy classes. They're cheap, and some of them are really well put together. GitHub repo. So this was available on a separate GitHub repo, but it is now available as part of the distro. So the full distribution of Ansible, whenever you get the latest, like to install it, you're just going to run yum install Ansible, and that's going to get you the latest distribution, and all of these modules are included in the latest distribution, and the releases come out, with the latest distribution of Ansible. So you don't really need to sync your GitHub repo to make sure you have the latest, because you get the latest when you do the install. About, I think it was September. No, it wasn't October. Yes, it was. It was October the 1st, around about the time of Ansible Fest this year in Austin. NetApp and Ansible and Cisco and a few other companies announced a partnership where we are doing, I think they're calling it Ansible Certified, and that doesn't necessarily imply that you get a certification like you would for RedHat or for NetApp or whatever, but it's saying that they certify, all the companies that are part of the partnership certify that these modules will work and do what they're supposed to do, and the documentation is there and it's supported, and they will support you in using those modules. So whenever that came about, that's when they said we're going to include all of this in the distribution. Are there any other questions?
There was a quick question regarding the slides. Will you be able to share the slides with the partners?
Yes, I'll share these slides, and I'll go through and clean up my some of my example playbooks, and I'll share those as well.
Okay, I think this. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Mary Jo LeBlanc from the NetApp on NetApp program at NetApp. If you have a topic you would like to find out if we have experience using a certain technology or a process or another technology in conjunction with a NetApp technology, please let Elias know, and we will try to bring a speaker in to talk to that topic.
Yes, I agree. This is very good, very good bit of information. The other thing I must say is we're going to try and organize these kind of sessions every third Thursday in the month. So next month's third Thursday, we'll have another inform session from the NetApp on NetApp team, and I will send you all the information and the invitation.
So, we're always using new stuff. So if there's something that's new, don't assume that it's too new for us to be using it, because we're probably using it before it's even available to anybody else. So, when it's just released and you go, man, I got this question about this new product, ask, and there's a really good chance that we're using it.
By the way, Ezra, I've installed Ansible on Ubuntu on the VMware workstation, and it was very straightforward. Just use the apt-get command.
Oh yeah.
And it installed in within a minute, actually.
Yeah, and then you can start using it to automate all kinds of things. I mean, not just the storage. You can automate anything in your environment, including Windows, believe it or not.
Yeah. Okay.